The Atlantic did not yield its secrets easily in the summer of 1587. Its surface glittered under the sun like polished steel, but beneath it lay a long memory of broken hulls, vanished crews, and prayers swallowed by wind. When the ships bearing John White and his colonists finally sighted the low, forested outline of Roanoke Island, relief moved through the decks like a held breath released. After months at sea, the land looked solid, forgiving, an illusion that history would later strip away. Roanoke Island lay within the vast estuary of what is now North Carolina's Outer Banks, a place of shifting sands, treacherous inlets, and dense maritime forests. To the English eye, it appeared fertile and strategically placed, a foothold for empire in a new world increasingly contested by Spain. But this was not untouched land. Algonquian-speaking peoples, most notably the CROATOAN, had lived, fished, and traded here for generations. The island already had a memory, and it would not easily accept a new one. This was not England's first attempt at Roanoke. 2 years earlier, in 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh's initial colony, more military outpost than settlement, had struggled through food shortages, frayed relations with local tribes, and internal discord. That effort ended not with triumph, but with quiet retreat, the colonists departing with Sir Francis Drake after supplies ran thin and tempers thinner. Yet England, buoyed by ambition and the looming threat of Spanish dominance, refused to abandon the dream. Now, in 1587, the endeavor carried a different character. This was not merely a garrison but a community, men, women, and children, around 115 souls, sent to establish a permanent English presence. At their head stood John White, an artist, mapmaker, and gentleman-appointed governor. White was not a soldier by nature. His tools were ink and observation, not steel. He had previously sailed with the 1585 expedition, sketching the people and landscapes of the region with a documentarian's care. That experience lent him a fragile confidence. He believed Roanoke could be made to work. As the ships anchored and boats ferried colonists ashore, the island greeted them with humid air heavy with pine resin and salt. The ruins of the earlier settlements still lingered, rotting timbers, overgrown paths, the ghostly outlines of failed intentions. For some, this familiarity was reassuring. For others, it was a warning. Among the colonists was Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, newly married to Ananias Dare. She was visibly pregnant when she stepped onto Roanoke soil, a living emblem of continuity and risk. Within weeks, on August 18, 1587, she would give birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. The event was celebrated modestly, yet symbolically. A child born here meant roots, not just ambition. England had arrived not merely to claim, but to stay. Yet beneath the surface optimism, the colony's foundations were already cracking. Relations with the local tribes were strained from the outset. The memory of the 1585 expedition lingered bitterly among the Secottan and Aquascagok peoples, whose villages had been burned and whose trust had been violated. The CROATOAN, led by Chief Manteo, an ally of the English and a man who had traveled to London, remained friendly, but they were not the dominant power in the region. Roanoke was a contested space, politically and spiritually. Early on, a grim incident set the tone. One of the colonists, George Howe, was killed while crabbing alone in the Sound. His body was found pierced with arrows. The message was unmistakable: the land was not pacified, and isolation was deadly. The colonists fortified themselves as best they could, repairing old structures and erecting new ones, but their numbers were small, their supplies limited, and their understanding of the land incomplete. Food became an immediate concern. The timing of the landing, late summer, left little room for planting. Hunting and fishing helped, but not enough. The colonists had been promised regular resupply from England, yet they carried with them a troubling awareness: the Atlantic was vast, and England's attention was increasingly pulled toward war. Spain loomed large in every English calculation. By 1587, the threat of the Spanish Armada was no longer theoretical. Queen Elizabeth I was preparing for conflict, diverting ships, sailors, and resources toward defense. This geopolitical reality pressed heavily on the colony, though few fully grasped how devastating its consequences would be. As weeks passed, it became clear that John White faced an impossible choice. The colony needed supplies, tools, food, weapons, and reassurance from the Crown. Remaining on Roanoke without reinforcement risked slow collapse. Yet leaving meant abandoning his daughter, his granddaughter, and an entire community in an uncertain land. The colonists urged him to go. They did not do so lightly. Records suggest intense debate, fearful but pragmatic. White was the only one with sufficient authority and familiarity to plead their case in England. The plan, agreed upon collectively, was simple in concept and fragile in execution. White would return to England, gather supplies, and come back as quickly as possible. If the colonists chose or were forced to relocate in his absence, they would leave a clear sign of their destination. The chosen sign was agreed upon with solemn care. If they moved willingly, they would carve the name of their new location into a tree or post. If they were under duress, they would add a Maltese cross, a symbol of distress. No cross. Just a name. In late August 1587, John White boarded a ship and watched Roanoke Island recede into the haze. His granddaughter, Virginia, was barely days old. He could not know that this farewell would stretch into years, nor that history would remember him less for what he did than for what he never saw again. The Atlantic closed behind him. White's journey back to England was slower than expected, delayed by storms and privateering skirmishes. When he finally arrived, he found a nation bracing for war. The Spanish Armada consumed England's naval capacity, ships were commandeered, ports locked down, priorities redrawn. White pleaded, petitioned, waited. Months passed. Then years. It would not be until August 1590, 3 years after his departure, that John White would stand once more on the shores of Roanoke Island. By then, the colony had already slipped into legend. But in 1587, as White's ship vanished beyond the horizon, the colonists of Roanoke were still alive, still hoping, still listening for sails on the edge of the world, unaware that they were standing at the threshold of one of history's most enduring silences. The island changed its voice after John White left. At first, the days still carried expectation. The colonists listened for the snap of canvas in the wind, scanned the horizon from the sandy ridges, and counted time not in dates but in tides. White had promised to return by the following spring. Ships crossed the Atlantic regularly enough, they told themselves. England had invested too much to abandon them. This absence was temporary. But the seasons moved with a slow indifference. Autumn arrived early along the Outer Banks. The heat softened, mosquitoes retreated into the marshes, and the forests thickened with falling leaves. For the colonists, autumn was both relief and warning. It brought better hunting and clearer air, but it also marked the narrowing window before winter, a season none of them fully understood in this strange land. Food dominated every conversation. The colony's supplies, already stretched thin, dwindled faster than expected. Corn stored from earlier exchanges with local tribes proved insufficient. Fishing in the sounds helped, but storms often made the waters dangerous. Deer and small game were hunted cautiously, always with armed watchmen posted nearby. The memory of George Howe's death was never far from anyone's mind. Leadership within the colony became more complex in White's absence. Though he was governor by appointment, authority had passed informally to a council of senior men, Simon Fernandez, Edward Stafford, and others whose names appear only faintly in surviving records. Decisions were practical, not ideological: where to gather food, how many to risk on hunting parties, whether to seek aid from neighboring tribes. Relations with the CROATOAN remained the colony's fragile lifeline. Manteo, baptized and named Lord of Roanoke by the English, continued to act as intermediary. Trade resumed cautiously: corn for metal tools, cloth, and beads. Yet even this alliance carried tension. The CROATOAN could offer help, but not salvation. They were themselves bound by seasonal scarcity and the politics of surrounding tribes. Winter tested the colony's cohesion. The cold along the Carolina coast was not the brutal freeze of northern Europe, but it was damp, penetrating, and relentless. Fires burned constantly. Roofs leaked. Salt air corroded tools faster than replacements could be fashioned. Illness spread quietly: fevers, infections, ailments whose causes were poorly understood. There is no surviving list of the dead, but it is difficult to imagine that all 115 survived those months intact. For Eleanor Dare, winter carried a private terror. Her daughter Virginia, born into a world already short on certainty, was vulnerable in ways the adults were not. Infants required steady nourishment, warmth, and calm, luxuries Roanoke struggled to provide. Yet Virginia lived, and in that survival alone, the colonists found a stubborn kind of hope. If a child could endure, perhaps the colony could as well. Spring brought renewal, and disappointment. As the ice melted from the shallows and green returned to the forests, eyes turned again to the sea. Every unfamiliar sail quickened the heart. Every gull's cry was mistaken for something else. But no English ships arrived. The Atlantic remained empty, its silence stretching from weeks into months. The colonists began to understand the truth before they spoke it aloud: something had gone wrong in England. They could not know the details: the armada, the redirected fleets, the political paralysis, but absence itself was a message. The longer White failed to return, the more dangerous waiting became. Supplies would not last indefinitely. The colony could not remain suspended between expectation and decay. It was during this period that the idea of relocation likely took shape, not as desperation, but as strategy. Roanoke Island, for all its promise, had proven difficult. Its soil was sandy, its fresh water limited, its position exposed. The mainland, by contrast, offered rivers, deeper forests, and potentially stronger alliances. Some colonists argued for moving closer to the Croatan people, south to Hatteras Island, where food sources were more reliable and relations more stable. Others feared such a move. Relocation meant abandoning the structures they had built, the symbolic claim they represented. It also meant crossing territory controlled by groups less friendly to the English. Every step beyond Roanoke carried risk. Yet staying carried risk as well. By the second year, waiting was no longer neutral, it was dangerous. Tools broke. Clothing wore thin. Ammunition dwindled. Even iron nails, once common, became precious. The colonists reused, repaired, repurposed everything. Archaeological evidence found centuries later, broken tools reshaped, fragments carefully preserved, suggests a community already adapting to long-term survival rather than short-term relief. Children grew. Adults aged faster. Virginia Dare learned to walk on sand and pine needles. She learned the sounds of the island before she ever heard church bells or English streets. By the time she could speak, England would have been an abstraction, a story told by tired adults around firelight. By the third year, the colony's situation had crossed an invisible line. Hope of White's return had not vanished entirely, but it had weakened. Decisions now had to assume permanence, not rescue. The agreement White had made with them, the carved message, the sign, took on new significance. If they moved, history would need a trace. Not for themselves, but for the man who might one day return. The choice to leave Roanoke, if that is indeed what they did, was likely not sudden. It would have unfolded over weeks or months, debated in low voices, measured against weather patterns and tribal intelligence. The colonists were not panicked refugees. They were settlers calculating survival. At some point, the decision became action. Structures were dismantled selectively, not destroyed in haste, but taken apart. Useful materials traveled with them, iron fittings, tools, perhaps even sections of wood. Personal belongings lightened to what could be carried. Graves, if any existed, were left behind without markers strong enough to endure time. Before departure, the message was carved. On a post or tree, accounts differ, the word CROATOAN was cut cleanly into the wood. No Maltese cross accompanied it. According to the agreement with White, this meant the move was voluntary, not forced by violence. The colonists wanted him to know that, wherever they were going, it was by choice, or at least by necessity, not massacre. Then they left. Whether they traveled in small groups or as a single caravan remains unknown. Whether all 115 went together is equally uncertain. It is possible that some stayed behind temporarily, or that others died before the journey began. History does not record their faces at the moment of departure, only the absence they left behind. The island swallowed their footsteps quickly. Grass reclaimed paths. Wind scattered ash from cold hearths. Rain softened the carved letters but did not erase them. Roanoke returned to quiet, holding its secret without commentary. In August 1590, 3 years after he had last seen them, John White finally returned. His ship anchored offshore on his birthday. The irony would not have been lost on him. As White stepped onto the island, he found no welcoming party, no smoke rising from chimneys, no sound of life. The settlement was dismantled, not destroyed. No bodies lay unburied. No signs of battle marked the ground. Only silence, and a single word cut into wood. But White did not yet know what that word truly meant, nor how completely it would come to define one of history's most enduring mysteries. That revelation awaited him deeper inland, where hope and dread met carved letters in fading bark. John White stepped onto Roanoke Island with the cautious reverence of a man entering a graveyard whose names he already knew. The landing itself was ill-omened. The voyage back from England had been plagued by storms and privateering delays, and when White's ships finally reached the Outer Banks in August 1590, rough seas nearly wrecked them. One of his sailors drowned in the surf while attempting to reach shore. It was White's birthday, an irony so sharp it scarcely required reflection. Fate, it seemed, had not softened in his absence. The settlement lay inland, beyond the dunes and tangled maritime forest. White moved quickly, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. 3 years was a long time, yes, but not an eternity. Colonies endured hardship. People adapted. Perhaps they had simply relocated nearby, leaving clear instructions as agreed. The first sign appeared sooner than expected. On a tree at the edge of the settlement, deeply cut into the bark, were letters. CROATOAN. White stopped. This was no idle marking. The word was deliberate, carefully carved, not scratched in panic. There was no cross above it. No symbol of distress. According to the agreement made in 1587, this meant the colonists had moved voluntarily, not under threat. The message was not a scream, it was a statement. Relief and terror arrived together. CROATOAN was not an unfamiliar name. It referred both to the CROATOAN people and to the island south of Roanoke, present-day Hatteras Island, where Mantio's kin lived. White had expected this possibility. In fact, the colonists had discussed it openly before his departure. If Roanoke proved unsustainable, CROATOAN was the logical alternative. Yet logic did not erase fear. White moved deeper into the settlement. Houses had been taken down, not burned. Palisades were dismantled methodically. Chests were gone. Tools were missing. It looked less like abandonment than migration. The absence of chaos disturbed him more than destruction would have. This was not a scene of violence, it was the aftermath of a decision. But some absences cut deeper than others. White searched desperately for personal items, books, papers, keepsakes he might recognize. Among them was a chest containing his maps and drawings, works of enormous personal and historical value. He found nothing. Either the chest had been carried away or destroyed long ago. To White, this loss felt intimate, as if part of his own memory had been erased. More importantly, he searched for signs of Eleanor and Virginia. There were no children's belongings left behind. No clothing, no toys. This suggested that the colonists had taken their families with them. It was a small comfort, but a powerful one. If they had fled suddenly or been attacked, such items would have remained. The conclusion seemed unavoidable, the colony had moved to CROATOAN Island. White's next step should have been simple. He should have sailed south immediately to find them. But the sea intervened once again. As White prepared to leave Roanoke and sail toward CROATOAN, weather turned violently against him. Storms battered the ships, damaged rigging, and exhausted the crew. The captains, privateers more interested in profit than patience, refused to risk further damage along the treacherous outer banks. Their priority was survival, not reunion. White protested. He argued. He pleaded. He offered personal payment. But he was not the master of the ships, and his authority extended only so far. Against his will, the decision was made to abandon the search and return to England. The moment was devastating. White stood on the shore, staring southward toward CROATOAN Island, barely 50 miles away, separated by water he could not cross. Somewhere in that direction, his daughter and granddaughter might still be alive. He had come within reach of answers, only to be denied by wind and human fear. History would later judge this moment harshly, though unfairly. White did not choose to leave. He was overruled by circumstance, weather, and the fragile economics of private voyages. Still, the result was the same. The lost colony remained lost. White returned to England carrying only absence and questions. He never again attempted to reach Roanoke. Records suggest he lived for several more years, fading into obscurity. He left behind no triumphant account, no resolution, only a mystery that would outlive him by centuries. Yet the carved word CROATOAN did not end the story. It transformed it. In the years and decades that followed, English settlers returned to the region. They heard rumors, whispers of white-skinned people living among native tribes, of gray-eyed children who spoke Algonquian tongues, of villages where English words survived like fossils embedded in speech. These accounts were inconsistent, filtered through bias and speculation, but they refused to vanish entirely. Some reports described native peoples wearing European clothing. Others mention crosses, or fragments of iron tools, or practices that seemed oddly familiar to English observers. None were definitive. All were tantalizing. Archaeology, centuries later, would add fragments to the puzzle. On Hatteras Island, European artifacts from the late 16th century were found, pieces of armor, weaponry, and tools that predated later English settlements. These findings suggest sustained contact between Europeans and the Croatan people, lending weight to the idea that at least some of the Roanoke colonists were absorbed into native communities. Absorbed, not erased. This distinction matters. The traditional narrative of Roanoke as a colony that vanished implies sudden disappearance, perhaps massacre. But the evidence points elsewhere, toward dispersal, adaptation, survival through transformation. The colonists may not have died as a group. They may have ceased to exist as a distinct English community. From an imperial perspective, this was failure. From a human one, it may have been endurance. The English settlers arrived expecting to impose permanence on a land they barely understood. When that plan failed, some of them may have chosen a different form of survival, one that required abandoning language, identity, and the story England wanted them to live. The word CROATOAN stands at the center of this transformation. It is not a symbol of mystery so much as of transition. It marks the point where English history blurs into native history, where written records fall silent and oral memory takes over. And silence, in history, is often mistaken for death. But silence can also mean something else, that the story continued in a form the record keepers could no longer recognize. History often treats disappearance as an ending. For the people of Roanoke, it may have been a beginning, one that required the shedding of names, language, and allegiance in order to remain alive. If the colonists did indeed move to Croatoan Island, they entered a world governed by different rules of survival. The Croatan were not strangers to hardship. They understood the tides, the rhythms of fishing and planting, the delicate balance between coastal abundance and seasonal scarcity. To live among them was to submit to knowledge older than England's ambitions in the New World. Absorption would not have been immediate, nor equal. The English arrived weakened, physically, politically, and numerically. Their tools and weapons, once symbols of advantage, were finite and increasingly fragile. Gunpowder ran out. Metal rusted. What they still possessed in abundance was vulnerability. In such conditions, power flowed not from technology but from adaptation. The Croatan, led by kin networks rather than centralized authority, would have weighed their options carefully. Hosting the English carried risk, disease, retaliation from rival tribes, and the burden of extra mouths to feed. But it also carried opportunity. European tools, even broken ones, were valuable. Knowledge of distant lands, maritime navigation, and English intentions could be strategically useful. Mutual need, not charity, likely shaped the encounter. Archaeological traces support this slow blending. On Hatteras Island, researchers have uncovered European-style artifacts dated to the late 16th century, well before later English settlements like Jamestown. These include iron tools and fragments that suggest long-term use rather than brief contact. Such evidence aligns with a scenario in which colonists did not merely pass through but stayed. For the colonists, survival meant learning quickly. English farming techniques were poorly suited to coastal Carolina. Native agricultural practices, particularly the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, offered a sustainable alternative. Fishing with weirs, harvesting shellfish, navigating shallow sounds in canoes, these were skills learned by watching, imitating, and eventually participating. Language followed necessity. English words faded. Algonquian terms replaced them. Children like Virginia Dare would have adapted fastest, absorbing sound and meaning without resistance. To them, English identity may have become something overheard rather than lived. Clothing changed. European fabrics decayed quickly in the coastal climate. Native garments, practical, reparable, suited to heat and movement, became the norm. The visual markers of Englishness disappeared first. Names followed. Christian naming practices held little meaning outside their original social structure. As individuals married into Croatan families, their English surnames would have vanished, replaced by kinship identities tied to lineage and role rather than inherited prestige. Conversion did not require erasure of memory, but it did require silence about origins that no longer served survival. This was not unique in colonial history. Similar processes occurred across the Americas when small European groups lost the support of their empires. What made Roanoke unusual was not assimilation, but that England never regained the thread of the story. English settlers who arrived later searched for continuity. They wanted ruins, graves, or survivors who could speak their language and validate their claims. What they found instead were people who did not, or could not, tell the story England wanted to hear. Oral history does not preserve names the way written history does. It preserves meaning, adaptation, and relationship. If Roanoke survivors were remembered within Croatan communities, they would have been remembered not as English colonists, but as relatives who arrived from the sea during a time of hunger. This distinction mattered little to those who lived it. It mattered greatly to those who came searching later. By the early 17th century, English reports began to circulate of native people with lighter skin, gray or blue eyes, and knowledge of English words. Some tribes were said to build houses with corner posts rather than round structures. Others reportedly practiced Christianity in altered forms. These accounts were speculative, filtered through expectation and prejudice, but they persisted stubbornly. One such report came from Jamestown in 1607, when settlers heard of a tribe inland whose members were said to have European ancestry. Another, later, spoke of native leaders who claimed descent from white ancestors who had come from the sea generations earlier. None of these accounts can be proven conclusively. But together, they suggest that Roanoke's people did not vanish, they scattered. Scattering is harder to trace than destruction. It leaves no single site of tragedy, no moment of catastrophe. It replaces endings with transitions, which history often finds unsatisfying. Empires prefer clean narratives, conquest or defeat, success or failure. Roanoke offered neither. It offered ambiguity. And ambiguity breeds myth. Over time, darker explanations took root. Stories of massacre, ritual sacrifice, or supernatural intervention gained popularity precisely because they imposed drama on uncertainty. A colony that vanished was more compelling than one that survived quietly by abandoning its original identity. Yet the evidence does not support violence on a large scale. There are no mass graves, no burned fortifications, no recorded tribal boasts of victory. What exists instead is absence, and the practical signs of relocation. Roanoke's true legacy may be this: it exposed the fragility of identity when stripped of institutional support. Without resupply, without reinforcement, without cultural dominance, Englishness itself proved negotiable. For the men and women who stepped away from Roanoke Island, survival demanded humility. It required acknowledging that the land already had teachers, and that listening was more powerful than imposing. They became something else. Not English settlers. Not legends. But people whose lives continued beyond the reach of ink and empire. And in doing so, they left behind not a ghost, but a question that history has been asking ever since. What counts as disappearance, when life goes on? The lost colony did not disappear from English consciousness when John White sailed away for the last time. On the contrary, Roanoke's absence became an obsession, an unresolved chord in the imperial imagination that resonated for decades. What could not be found could not be forgotten. When England returned to the American coast in earnest with the founding of Jamestown in 1607, Roanoke resurfaced almost immediately in conversation. The men who stepped ashore along the James River carried not only tools and ambition, but questions inherited from a previous generation. Somewhere between Cape Fear and the Chesapeake, an English community had once existed. Its fate mattered, not merely emotionally, but politically. If English settlers could vanish without explanation, the New World was far more dangerous than official propaganda allowed. Captain John Smith, soldier, explorer, and chronicler, was among those most intrigued. Smith gathered information obsessively, questioning native leaders about white people who had come before. His writings mention tribes with houses built in the English style and people who reportedly spoke of ancestors with pale skin and blue eyes. He also recorded claims that some of these people were slaughtered under the authority of Powhatan, though these accounts remain inconsistent and impossible to verify. Smith's reports reflected both curiosity and bias. Native oral histories were filtered through translation, misunderstanding, and Smith's own expectations. He was a man trained to see power, conquest, and betrayal. Peaceful assimilation did not fit his worldview as neatly as conflict. Other colonists echoed similar rumors. William Strachey, secretary of the Jamestown colony, wrote of native communities where children were said to read from books and people were familiar with English customs. He linked these stories directly to Roanoke, suggesting survival rather than annihilation. Yet even Strachey's account was second-hand, built on layers of retelling. The English crown took note, but did little. By the early 17th century, priorities had shifted. Jamestown struggled for its own survival. Spain remained a threat. Resources were limited. Recovering the Roanoke colonists, if they still lived, offered little tangible benefit. They would not bring gold, land titles, or strategic advantage. The mystery endured not because it demanded resolution, but because it was inconvenient to resolve. Over time, Roanoke became less a human story and more a cautionary symbol. Preachers invoked it as a warning against godlessness or poor planning. Colonial promoters reframed it as a lesson learned, an early mistake corrected by later settlements. In these retellings, the colonists themselves faded into abstraction, lost not as people, but as an idea. Meanwhile, among native communities, the memory, if preserved, would have taken a very different form. Oral tradition does not prioritize dates or imperial significance. It remembers relationships, conflicts, marriages, and migrations. If Roanoke survivors were absorbed into Croatan or other Algonquian groups, their story would not have been told as the disappearance of English settlers, but as the arrival of outsiders during a time of scarcity, followed by adaptation and kinship. This difference in historical grammar is crucial. What the English called lost, native communities may have called joined. The English obsession with absence was also tied to fear of vulnerability. Roanoke undermined the myth of European inevitability. It demonstrated that colonization was not a one-way process. Europeans could fail. They could be outlasted. They could become dependent. This was not a comforting lesson. By the mid-1600s, Roanoke had entered popular lore. The carved word CROATOAN took on symbolic weight, repeated in pamphlets and conversations as a riddle rather than a direction. Its meaning drifted. It no longer pointed clearly to Hatteras Island or the Croatan people. It became a cipher, something half understood and endlessly interpreted. Some speculated about Spanish involvement. Others imagined secret inland migrations, or total annihilation. A few even suggested divine punishment. Each theory revealed more about English anxieties than about Roanoke itself. What was notably absent from these debates was any sustained attempt to listen carefully to native accounts. English colonists recorded what interested them, not what challenged their assumptions. Stories that implied English settlers had willingly abandoned their identity were uncomfortable. They suggested that survival sometimes required surrendering the very thing empire sought to preserve. Roanoke's colonists, if alive among native peoples, would have represented a failure of control, not of courage, but of cultural permanence. By the late 17th century, the Lost Colony had effectively been sealed into myth. The individuals who composed it, Eleanor Dare, Ananias Dare, the craftsmen, farmers, children, were no longer treated as historical actors but as symbols of mystery. Their humanity dissolved into speculation. Yet traces lingered. Physical traces would emerge centuries later through archaeology. Cultural traces persisted in rumor and oral memory. But the most enduring trace was psychological. Roanoke haunted English colonization as proof that the New World did not bend easily to European plans. It reminded settlers that arrival did not guarantee dominance. The obsession with Roanoke was, at its core, an obsession with control over narrative. To explain Roanoke was to domesticate it, to force it into a story with a beginning, middle, and end. But Roanoke resisted such framing. Its story refused to end where England expected. And so it remained unresolved, not because evidence was entirely absent, but because the most plausible explanation required accepting something deeply unsettling. That the colonists survived by ceasing to be English. For centuries, Roanoke lived in ink and imagination. It was argued over in books, sermons, and speculative histories, but the land itself remained largely silent. Only in the modern era did the soil begin to speak, not in grand revelations, but in fragments so small they could be dismissed if one did not listen carefully. Archaeology does not offer endings. It offers interruptions. The first serious attempts to locate physical evidence of the lost colony began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven as much by national curiosity as by academic rigor. Early excavations on Roanoke Island revealed little of significance, no mass graves, no unmistakable signs of violent destruction. This absence, while frustrating to treasure hunters, was quietly consistent with the idea of abandonment rather than annihilation. More compelling discoveries emerged elsewhere. On Hatteras Island, historically known as CROATOAN, archaeologists began uncovering European artifacts embedded in native contexts. These were not the remains of a single, brief encounter. They suggested prolonged contact. Iron tools showed signs of repeated use. Fragments of weaponry were repurposed. Copper and brass objects appeared far from expected trade routes. Most striking was what did not appear, luxury items. There was no gold, no fine jewelry, no symbols of wealth. What remained were utilitarian objects, things meant to be used until they broke, and then used again. This pattern strongly suggested settlers living without resupply, adapting European materials into indigenous lifeways. One artifact in particular drew attention, a small iron bar and fragments of what appeared to be a rapier hilt, found within native settlement layers dated to the late 16th and early 17th centuries. These items did not align neatly with later English colonies. Their presence raised an uncomfortable possibility, that English material culture had survived beyond Roanoke, but not in English hands. In 2012, renewed interest surged when a patch on an early map drawn by John White himself was analyzed using modern imaging techniques. Beneath a paper patch lay a symbol resembling a fort, located inland along the Albemarle Sound, far from Roanoke Island. The site became known as Site X. Excavations at Site X revealed European artifacts dated to the correct period, including pottery and weapon fragments. While not definitive proof of a relocated colony, the findings supported a theory of dispersal, that Roanoke's colonists split into smaller groups, integrating into different native communities rather than moving as a single body. This pattern, fragmentation rather than consolidation, makes historical sense. A group of over 100 settlers would have been difficult for any single tribe to absorb. Smaller clusters, however, could be incorporated through marriage, labor, and shared survival. Archaeology, in this context, does not reveal a single destination. It reveals a process. Each artifact tells a story of continuity rather than catastrophe. A tool reused beyond its expected lifespan. A European object modified to fit indigenous needs. These are not the signatures of panic. They are the signatures of adaptation. Yet archaeology also reveals limits. No artifact carries a name. None speaks of Eleanor Dare, or Virginia, or any other individual. The soil preserves function, not identity. It cannot tell us whether families stayed together or were separated. It cannot tell us who survived and who did not. This uncertainty frustrates modern sensibilities, but it aligns with the reality of early colonial life. Survival was uneven. Some likely died during the transition. Others endured long enough to become ancestors whose origins were gradually forgotten. What archaeology does make increasingly difficult to argue is total disappearance. The idea of Roanoke as a colony that vanished without trace collapses under the weight of small things. Too many artifacts appear in the wrong places at the wrong times. Too many fragments point to continuity. The silence of written records is not mirrored by the land. This has forced historians to reconsider what evidence means in a colonial context. Written documents privilege those who had the power to write, and preserve writing. Indigenous societies preserved knowledge differently. When English settlers crossed into those societies, their stories crossed into a medium England did not control. Loss, in this case, was archival. Modern archaeologists approach Roanoke with caution, aware of how easily interpretation can slip into desire. Every discovery is scrutinized, debated, contextualized. The field has moved away from the hope of a single, dramatic find and toward a more complex understanding. Roanoke's story is scattered across landscapes and generations. And perhaps this scattering is itself the point. Empires measure success in permanence, cities built, borders drawn, names remembered. The Roanoke colonists left none of these in recognizable English form. What they may have left instead were descendants whose lives continued beyond the reach of imperial memory. In that sense, Roanoke was not erased by the New World. It was absorbed by it. The land did not destroy the colonists. It required them to change. And the fragments left behind, iron, copper, altered tools, are the quiet witnesses of that change, resisting centuries of myth with their stubborn, physical presence. Among all the names associated with Roanoke, none has endured as powerfully, or as ambiguously, as Virginia Dare. She left no written words, no recorded deeds, and no confirmed grave. Yet she became the most famous figure of the lost colony, not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. Virginia Dare was born on August 18, 1587, into uncertainty. Her birth was recorded carefully by her grandfather, John White, as an event of significance, the first English child born in the New World. In that moment, Virginia was less a person than a promise. She symbolized continuity, legitimacy, and the idea that England's presence in America could be generational, not temporary. When the colony vanished, that promise curdled into mystery. Virginia Dare became a vessel for speculation precisely because nothing was known of her fate. She could be imagined as anything: a child lost to the wilderness, a survivor raised among native peoples, a tragic figure who died young, or a symbolic bridge between cultures. Each generation reshaped her to fit its anxieties and hopes. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Virginia Dare had been transformed into folklore. One popular legend claimed she survived and grew into a woman known as the White Doe, cursed and transformed by jealous rivals, roaming the forests until she was finally killed by a silver arrow. The story was romantic, Gothic, and entirely unsupported by evidence. Yet it endured because it offered closure of a kind, turning historical silence into narrative drama. Other stories imagine Virginia as a tribal matriarch, her pale features diluted over generations but remembered in whispered ancestry. These accounts, while no more verifiable, were closer to historical plausibility. They reflected a growing, if uneasy, recognition that assimilation, not annihilation, might explain the colony's fate. Virginia's power lay in her innocence. As a child, she could not be blamed for political failure, poor planning, or imperial overreach. She became the lost colony in miniature, vulnerable, silent, and endlessly interpretable. Her imagined survival or death stood in for the fate of all 115 colonists. This symbolic weight reveals how history often operates. When evidence is thin, meaning expands to fill the void. Figures like Virginia Dare become screens onto which societies project fear, hope, guilt, or nostalgia. In early American nationalism, Virginia Dare was reclaimed as a proto-American figure, a child of English descent but born on American soil. She was cast as a spiritual ancestor of the nation, even though her actual life, if it continued at all, would have unfolded entirely outside the emerging colonial order. This appropriation was selective. The possibility that Virginia Dare might have grown up speaking an Algonquian language, practicing indigenous customs, and rejecting English identity did not fit the narrative of national origin. Such a version of her story was quietly sidelined in favor of mythic purity. Yet that sidelined version may be the most honest. If Virginia survived, she would have done so by adapting completely. Childhood would have accelerated her transformation. Memory of England would have come secondhand, filtered through adults whose own ties weakened over time. To her, Englishness might have been a story of hunger and waiting, not of belonging. In that sense, Virginia Dare challenges the idea that identity is inherited rather than lived. Her legend forces a question that empire prefers not to ask: what happens when the first generation belongs fully to one world, and the second belongs to another? Historians cannot answer that question definitively. But they can observe how fiercely it has been avoided. The elevation of Virginia Dare into symbol has often come at the cost of acknowledging indigenous presence. Her story is usually told as if she existed in isolation, surrounded by wilderness rather than people. This framing erases the native communities whose lives and decisions would have shaped her survival more than any English intention. Remembering Virginia Dare honestly requires remembering them as well. In recent scholarship, there has been a shift away from romantic myth and toward contextual realism. Virginia Dare is increasingly understood not as a tragic ghost or national mascot, but as a child whose fate was bound to indigenous systems of kinship and care. This reframing does not make her story less compelling. It makes it more human. She was not lost in a forest. She was born at the edge of two worlds, and one of those worlds proved far more capable of sustaining life than the other. The power of Virginia Dare lies not in mystery alone, but in what her silence exposes, how quickly symbols replace people, and how easily history prefers legend over adaptation. In the end, Virginia Dare may not represent disappearance at all. She may represent the first American child to become something other than English. The longer Roanoke is examined, the more uncomfortable its most plausible explanation becomes. Not because it is unbelievable, but because it undermines the narrative architecture of empire. Survival through assimilation does not fit neatly into stories of conquest, triumph, or martyrdom. It exists in the margins, where history grows uneasy. Empires prefer endings that justify beginnings. If Roanoke had been massacred, it could be mourned and avenged. If it had starved, it could be blamed on poor planning and corrected in future attempts. But survival, quiet, adaptive, unrecorded, offers no moral clarity. It implies that English colonists lived on by abandoning the very identity that defined their mission. This is the inconvenient truth at the heart of Roanoke. The evidence increasingly points not to a single fate, but to many. Some colonists likely died in the years following White's departure, through illness, injury, or conflict. Others moved inland. Others south. Some may have been taken in by the CROATOAN. Others by different Algonquian groups. Over time, these individuals ceased to be colonists at all. From a human perspective, this was success. From an imperial one, it was failure. The English crown measured colonial success in permanence, extraction, and replication of English society. Roanoke produced none of these. It left no church records, no tax rolls, no enduring English-speaking community. By imperial standards, it vanished. But survival does not require recognition. Modern historical frameworks struggle with this kind of outcome. Western historiography privileges continuity of institutions over continuity of people. Roanoke's story challenges that bias by presenting a scenario in which people endured while institutions dissolved. This tension explains why more sensational theories continue to circulate. Violence, supernatural disappearance, or conspiratorial intervention offer clean narratives. They restore hierarchy and drama. Assimilation, by contrast, is messy, morally ambiguous, and resistant to spectacle. Yet the land itself supports the quieter story. The geographic logic of the Outer Banks and surrounding mainland favors dispersal. The region's waterways form a natural network connecting islands, rivers, and inland settlements. Movement by canoe would have been far easier than movement by sea. The colonists, once dependent on ships, may have discovered that their survival lay in letting go of maritime isolation altogether. This would have required trust. Trust in people England had previously treated as obstacles or tools. Trust in systems of knowledge dismissed as primitive. Trust that survival did not require dominance. The willingness, or necessity, to place that trust may have been the colony's most radical act. There is also a demographic reality often overlooked. Even if all 115 colonists survived the initial transition, their genetic and cultural footprint would have diluted rapidly. Within 2 or 3 generations, English ancestry would no longer be visually or linguistically obvious. Memory would shift from origin to relationship. This does not erase them. It absorbs them. In this sense, Roanoke's colonists may still be present, not as a discrete group, but as ancestors woven into the broader tapestry of native history. Their disappearance exists primarily in English records, not in lived reality. The problem is that absorption leaves no monument. There is no plaque for adaptation. No ruin for quiet endurance. History, especially colonial history, prefers stones over stories. And so Roanoke remains lost, largely because the framework used to search for it refuses to recognize survival without sovereignty. To accept assimilation as the likely outcome requires redefining loss itself. It means acknowledging that English identity was not inevitable or invincible. It means admitting that the first permanent English presence in America may have succeeded only by ceasing to be English. This is not a romantic conclusion. It does not celebrate harmony or erase hardship. Assimilation would have involved pain, compromise, and the slow erosion of memory. Some colonists may have resisted. Some may have died because they could not adapt. But it is a human conclusion. One that honors the intelligence of the colonists rather than casting them as helpless victims. One that recognizes indigenous agency rather than reducing native peoples to faceless threats or saviors. Roanoke's story endures because it sits at the intersection of vulnerability and choice. It exposes the thinness of imperial confidence and the depth of local knowledge. In doing so, it asks a final, unsettling question. If survival required becoming someone else, would you call that being lost? Roanoke has endured not because it is unsolved, but because it resists closure. Most historical mysteries fade once evidence accumulates. Roanoke has done the opposite. With each archaeological discovery, each reassessment of colonial records, the story becomes less dramatic, and more unsettling. The clearer the likely outcome becomes, the harder it is to accept. History struggles most with stories that deny it an ending. The Lost Colony occupies a rare space where absence is not a gap in knowledge but a challenge to interpretation. The question is no longer what happened. But why does the answer remain so unsatisfying? The likely explanation, dispersal, adaptation, absorption, refuses to offer a single moment of resolution. There is no final day at Roanoke. No last stand. No documented farewell. Instead, there is a gradual unthreading. This unthreading frustrates the archival impulse. Written history depends on fixed points, treaties signed, battles fought, deaths recorded. Roanoke offers none of these at the moment it matters most. It dissolves slowly, in ways that leave no clear timestamp. This has made Roanoke unusually vulnerable to appropriation. In different eras, it has been used to support wildly different agendas. To some, it was evidence of divine judgment. To others, a warning against colonial arrogance. In the 19th century, it became a romantic frontier tragedy. In the 20th, a puzzle to be solved through science. Each interpretation said more about its moment than about the people who lived and died, or lived on, after 1587. What rarely changes is the framing of loss. The English called Roanoke lost, because they could no longer locate it within their own systems of meaning. But the colonists were not lost to the land, nor necessarily to each other. They were lost to England. This distinction matters. History often equates loss with death because death is legible. It leaves remains, rituals, records. Assimilation leaves continuity without documentation. It allows life to proceed without leaving a signature recognizable to outsiders. In that sense, Roanoke exposes a limitation of historical method itself. Archaeology can find objects. Anthropology can reconstruct patterns. But neither can restore identity once it has been willingly, or necessarily, shed. Names vanish first. Then languages. Then stories that no longer serve those who tell them. This does not mean the colonists' experiences were erased. It means they were preserved in a form history is poorly equipped to recognize. Modern scholarship increasingly accepts this discomfort. Rather than seeking a definitive end, historians now ask different questions. How did colonial failure reshape English strategy? How did indigenous resilience alter the trajectory of settlement? What does Roanoke reveal about the fragility of imposed identities? In this reframing, Roanoke becomes less of a mystery and more of a mirror. It reflects the assumptions historians bring to the past. When we expect disappearance, we interpret silence as death. When we expect dominance, we interpret adaptation as failure. Roanoke invites a different reading. It suggests that history does not always move forward through conquest. Sometimes it moves sideways, into relationships and compromises that do not leave monuments. The colonists' decision, if indeed it was a decision, to disperse rather than perish was an assertion of agency. They chose life over legacy. That choice cost them a place in English history, but it may have granted them something far more immediate: survival. And perhaps that is why Roanoke continues to haunt. It forces a confrontation with the idea that history remembers the wrong things. That those who adapt are often forgotten, while those who die dramatically are immortalized. The Lost Colony is not unresolved because evidence is missing. It is unresolved because the most coherent explanation demands humility, an acknowledgement that English plans failed, that indigenous systems endured, and that the line between colonizer and colonized was more porous than empire wished to admit. Roanoke does not ask to be solved. It asks to be understood on its own terms. Roanoke ends not with an answer, but with a recalibration of what disappearance means. By the time modern historians arrive at the story's edge, the expectation of a dramatic conclusion has already been worn away. What remains is quieter, but more enduring, the realization that the lost colony did not vanish into nothingness. It slipped sideways out of the frame history was using to see it. This final chapter is not about solving Roanoke. It is about releasing it from the need to be solved. The colonists who stepped away from Roanoke Island in the late 1580s did so under conditions few modern societies can fully imagine. They were isolated by an ocean, abandoned by circumstance, and surrounded by people whose knowledge of the land far exceeded their own. Their choices were constrained, their futures uncertain. Yet within those constraints, they acted. They dismantled their settlement deliberately. They marked their destination clearly. They carried their children, their tools, and what remained of their lives into a different social world. Nothing about this suggests panic. It suggests calculation. What followed was not an ending, but a transformation. If the colonists were absorbed into native communities, as archaeological evidence and historical logic increasingly suggest, their lives continued in forms England no longer recognized as success. Their children grew into adulthood speaking different languages, practicing different customs, measuring time by seasons rather than by ships expected from across the sea. England lost track of them not because they died, but because they stopped being legible. This distinction carries weight beyond Roanoke. The lost colony has long been treated as a failure of logistics or leadership. But it may more accurately be understood as a failure of imagination. England could envision how to build colonies, extract resources, and enforce hierarchy. It struggled to imagine survival without dominance. Roanoke exposes that limitation. It reveals a moment when European presence in the Americas was not yet inevitable, when outcomes were still contingent, fragile, and negotiable. Before Jamestown, before plantation economies, before the hardening of racial and cultural boundaries, there existed a brief, uncomfortable possibility, that Europeans might have to adapt more than they conquered. That possibility flickers in the carved word CROATOAN. It is not a riddle meant to taunt future generations. It is a practical message left by people who believed they might be found again. That they were not found says more about the searchers than the searched. John White never saw his daughter or granddaughter again. That loss is real, personal, and unredeemable. No reframing of history can soften it. But White's failure to reunite with them does not define their fate, only his. History often privileges those who return to tell the story. Roanoke belongs to those who did not. Its legacy lives not in ruins or records, but in a challenge to historical instinct. It asks us to consider that endurance does not always announce itself. That continuity can exist without documentation. That survival may require surrendering the very identity that history later insists upon. The lost colony endures because it reminds us of something fundamental. That history is not only written by the victorious, but also shaped by those who choose life over remembrance. Roanoke was not erased by violence, nor swallowed by wilderness. It was carried forward, quietly, imperfectly, and beyond the reach of empire. And that, perhaps, is why it still refuses to be silent.